Hello everyone, my name is Allegra Integra and my hair is in my face and it is getting late, but I wanted to make sure I got this filmed. So what else is new? I am filming late and unorganized, so let's get right to it. Actually, before we do that, I do want to introduce my newest plant friend. This is a real plant, it's a fiddly fig. You're gonna see my background change again as the summer month starts to wane and it gets cold overnight. I will be bringing my plants back in. If you know anything about fiddly figs, don't expect to see her looking so beautiful for this long, but I thought I'd give it a try. So hopefully I will get my lovely background back soon. And to get right into the reading content, in the month of August, I read 6 books. I gave 1 2-star, 1 3-star, 3 4-star, and 1 5-star reviews this month. So I would say that's a pretty good reading month. Definitely running the gamut on like how much I enjoyed the books that I read. The gamut. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the depth of reading that I did this month. I had several different genres, including satire, a thriller, or like psychological domestic fiction. I actually had a couple of those, and I even read a YA, and it was a contemporary YA, which I find, well, you'll see how I feel about that, but I'm actually pretty surprised and pleasantly so with the way that my reading month went. A few other stats off the top of my head. Of the 6 books, 5 of them were from the library, 1 was an audiobook, and 2 were ebooks. The rest were in print. And I also DNF'd a book. I had started listening to it even though I own a physical copy of this, and I could not get into it. I might return to this book in the future, but I don't know. That would be Things in Jars. This is a fantasy, I thought, set in Victorian England, and the general... I was 14% in on the audiobook and I just wasn't enjoying the way that the characters were being described, and I felt that the writing style is very stilted. I've noticed that writing style is beginning to really matter to me, when in the past, if the story was good, I could kind of overlook certain stilted prose. I don't know what this says about my desire to explore classics more, because I know a lot of people do have problems with the dryness or like the way that the sentences flow, especially in translated works, which a number of the classics I'm wanting to get to are translated. But regardless, I have had a really rough couple months. I've been really busy and I want to enjoy my reading. I want this hobby to remain something that I look at and get into because it's relaxing to me. It's something that's helping me kind of escape from my everyday frustrations, and this book definitely wasn't doing that for me. It was simply making me more frustrated. So that's why I DNF'd this. It's not a hard DNF. I may return to it, but I'm guessing that if I do, it will be far down the line. The first book that I did finish in August was With Teeth by Kristen Arnett. It was initially pitched to me as like a bad seed, we need to talk about Kevin style book, and it is and it isn't that. You're following Sammy, who is a woman who's given birth to Samson. She's married to another woman named Monica, and Sammy has a lot of concerns about Samson and his behavior. And it starts when he's quite young, and then the story goes up to when Samson is college aged. And almost all of the book is from Sammy's point of view. However, you get these little interstitial, like one-page perspectives from other characters in the book. They're kind of one-off side characters. It's not Monica and it's not Samson himself, that explain someone else's perception of an incident that Sammy also experiences and explains in more detail. And this is used to clearly paint Sammy as an unreliable narrator, because is Samson actually a bad kid? He clearly does have adjustment issues. Like, there's no question that there's stuff going on with this kid. But how much of it is inherent and how much of it is Sammy's own problems and projections from her own childhood issues, from her own personal issues that she's refusing to get help for, or not even refusing to fully get help for. She does go to therapy in the book, but is refusing to actually put in the work to do what she needs to do to parent Samson appropriately. This book hit on so many of my anxieties. So I do not have children and I'm not planning on having children. Though that hasn't always been the case, I definitely toyed in the recent past, actually, about whether or not I wanted to be a mother. And I've made the decision for myself that I'm not going to. And one of the reasons that I worry so much about parenting and had so many anxieties about it and made the decision that I did is I feel like I might not be able to manage my own temper and my own flaws to raise a healthy person or to be able to give a child what they deserve. I know most parents feel that way, but I feel so strongly that I would fail in this that it's a decision it's something I've decided not to do. There's a scene specifically why this book is called With Teeth that just kind of chilled me, that involves biting, and it's definitely trigger warnings for abuse, gaslighting, just not handling your ish. Like Sammy goes to therapy in the book, but she's clearly not doing the work. And we even get a brief perspective from her therapist about the problems that Sammy's refusing to address. I guess really the way that I could sum this book up is big oof. It made me so uncomfortable, but it was written in a really engaging way, and it just seemed so realistic and painfully so, and it hit so many of my own insecurities that I'm still thinking about it, even though I finished this early in August. To kind of wrap it up, there was a quote from the book that really stuck out to me, which is, "Maybe love is always a thing resting on the edge of violence." And I'm not saying that I always feel violent or that I think love is violence, but I have a temper. Clearly Sammy also has a temper in this book, and I also feel things really passionately, and that doesn't necessarily always come out in the healthiest way. Done a lot of work on that myself. I do think that I'm more reliable than Sammy is, and that I've actually put in a lot of the work. But regardless, this hit so many of my insecurities, and it was written in such a unsettling way. I highly recommend this, but if you are planning on having children or recently had a child, maybe wait a bit. Just keep that in mind, that maybe that's not the best time to read this book, but it was fantastic. I ended up giving this 4 stars. Next, I read Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is an urban fantasy, and traditionally, I like the concept of urban fantasy, very similar to how I like the concept of like fae books, but I haven't found an urban fantasy that I particularly like. To be fair, I haven't read that many. I'm not a big fan of the Jim Butcher Dresden File books, so please don't recommend those. But this, I guess, falls under urban fantasy kind of superhero genre. Is that a genre? The plot of this book is pretty simple, although it's not rendered in a simple way. So we're following 2 college students who've decided to do a thesis on EOs, or extraordinary individuals, so superheroes, and how do people become superheroes in this world. They aren't completely accepted as real in this universe, but you find out really quickly that they are. And while this project seems to be like a really good idea for these 2 really brilliant people, Victor and Eli, it goes south really quickly, and then we're actually following, like, kind of time skipping why Victor and Eli separated as friends and what's happening in present day. And everyone in this is the bad guy, or rather everybody in this is many shades of gray, mostly dark shades of gray. In the attempt to study this, they just Eli and Victor find out that if you have a near-death experience, or you actually die and come back, for example, if your heart stops and you're brought back, you may develop basically superpowers, or become an EO. And they try this and it fails, and then they try it again and it succeeds. But the way that this happens leads to their schism. Overall, this book was really good. It was super fast-paced. I enjoyed the writing style. V.E. Schwab's writing is very easy to get through. It flows very smoothly. So kind of the opposite of that DNF I talked about earlier. It's a very sleek kind of writing, and it's really interesting. It's a page-turner. I initially gave this 4 stars, but upon reflection, there were a couple things in it that did bring it down to 3. That is not necessarily bad. I still enjoyed this a lot more than I enjoy most urban fantasies I've read. A lot of urban fantasies I haven't even been able to bring myself to finish. And I liked this enough that I will probably pursue the sequel. I've heard way mixed reviews about the sequel, but there were just a couple things that I found not enjoyable, or things that really colored my vision or my view of this book. And the number 1 is going to be a mild spoiler, so I'm going to put a little spoilery thing somewhere on the screen while I talk about this. There's also a character named Andy, and she is Eli's girlfriend and a friend of Victor's, and it's never suggested that Victor wanted to date her, but he was very jealous once her friendship got stronger with Eli and they began dating because Victor just wasn't getting the same amount of attention. Victor is pretty broken. Andy's entire purpose is to die to motivate both of these characters, which is called fridging the girlfriend. And there are other female characters, and they're pretty interesting female characters. Well, one of them is a pretty interesting female character in the book later, but that particular like cliche or trope really bothers me. I think the main reason that this didn't end up completely ruining the book for me is it does kind of get turned on its head a little. Eli was dating Andy when she died, and that was kind of the turning point for him to be like, EO shouldn't exist and this is terrible, but he's okay because his power is healing himself, like he can't die. Because of his religious background and the way that that integrates with his motivations, I think that keeps this from being a full, oh, the reason that I'm going on this raging rampage of revenge is because my girlfriend died, and that was her only reason for existing, was to give me motivation to move forward. He had other motivations as well, so I think that's what saved this from turning this into a 2-star, because I hate that trope. I just don't like it. But overall, it was an okay book. I was happy with it, with the exception of the spoiler stuff, as well as some of the motivations got a little wonky, and the back and forth timelines weren't always executed super well. She also did this in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and I particularly enjoyed that book, but I didn't find it I thought the writing again was really beautiful, but I didn't find the plot necessarily groundbreaking. And at the same time, this plot wasn't super groundbreaking, but I did appreciate that both of the protagonists are actually antagonists of differing shades of dark gray. Overall, this was 3 stars, a pretty enjoyable read. I'm glad I read it in the summer. It felt kind of like a summer thrillery book, and I am going to see about looking into V.E. Schwab's other works. The next book I listened to was Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq, and this book, I think it falls under magical realism. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how to define that genre, but that's what I'm either going to call it magical realism or modern folklore is what this book was. And so I listened to this book because when I first heard about it, I discovered that Tanya Tagaq is actually a throat singer. She is Inuk, which is, I believe, the term you use when you're talking about one person. So she's of the Inuit, and she's a throat singer. And in between chapters in the audiobook, she's throat singing, which is haunting and sometimes scary and sometimes really, really beautiful and really added to the atmosphere of the story. Planning on eventually buying a paper copy of this because I would definitely like to tab it, because it's kind of a mix of narrative prose and lyrics, like lyrical poetry writing that's still telling the story. And there's some really beautiful lines that I can't quote because I was listening and getting wrapped up in like the imagery itself as opposed to looking at the words on the page. This is, I think I'm already gushing about it when I hadn't even gotten to the plot. This is clearly 5 stars for me. The basic gist of the story, it's hard to explain just how beautifully well this was done, but it's following a young woman in, I believe, Nunavut. She's also Inuk, in the 70s, just picking up on different like cultural touchstones while she navigates surviving oppression, surviving the crushing poverty in the area, surviving the winters in that northern part of Canada. It's really brutal. Surviving predatory teachers and the general, just the things that she's encountering, as well as navigating the spirits in the area that are calling out to her because she's more sensitive than some of the other people. The way that they've helped her survive certain things, or like tuned her into certain things. And then she becomes pregnant and she has to come to terms with what the reality of what is essentially a supernatural pregnancy and her children, what they mean to the community and to her, and how is she going to deal with the consequences of their existence. Is it going to be tragic, and who is it going to be tragic for? This book is so beautiful and so upsetting. You guys, I keep reading upsetting books. It's major trigger warnings for sexual abuse, pedophilia, the systemic oppression. but also just some really beautiful, oh, and death of family members. Just beautiful, haunting swaths of words that I just got lost in. It's so hard to explain it because this is an experience, especially as an audiobook. I think that you should read this. It's really heavy. It's not something to go into lightly. And if you're not familiar with throat singing, maybe listen to some. I know that this author has also worked as a singer with Bjork. So to give you an idea of like what to expect if it's not something you're familiar with, because it is a really haunting thing. Sometimes it sounds like wolves howling, but this is all coming from a human being's throat and mouth. I'm just going to keep gushing about this if I keep going on and not sound particularly articulate about why I loved this so much. It's a modern fairy tale and when I say modern fairy tale, I mean including the dark aspects of it, including the way that the moral isn't necessarily super clear, and it's using a type of storytelling that you don't see all the time. And it's also talking about an era and a people that doesn't get as much attention as it should when we're talking about oppression, when we're talking about privilege, and when we're talking about different types of stories that we should be paying attention to be better at empathy, to better understand what's happening in the world, which is to say you should read this. Go in prepared for something hard and dark, but it is beautiful and sad, and I am still thinking about this. Here's an example though, with Teeth I'm still thinking about because of the way it impacted me directly and my concerns with that. Split Tooth is something that I want to roll over in my head so I can experience those words again and get underneath all of the different layers of what was happening in this book. I definitely need to listen to it again, and I plan on reading it again just so I can fully appreciate everything. And that's not to say the story is complicated. It's not, but the language is so layered and beautiful that it's something I want to fully experience in different ways so I can really immerse myself in this story. And in a complete reversal, the next book that I read was Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder. And this is a satire / domestic drama. So With Teeth is a domestic thriller, domestic fiction. And this is also, Night Bitch is also domestic fiction. And I heard some people say it was horror, but this is not a horror book. This is definitely not horror. I didn't like this. Most of the books that I've read this year about motherhood and anxieties about motherhood, which is a really strange thing for me to be reading, but whatever, are focused on upper middle class white women's concerns about parenting. In the case of With Teeth, it is focusing on a lesbian character and her concerns about that, including being a lesbian couple who are raising a male child. But overall, the stories aren't particularly varied, and I wonder if that hurt my view of this book, but I don't think that's the only reason I didn't enjoy this. Maybe it's because I don't understand the satire. Ultimately, what's happening is we're following the unnamed protagonist, and this is another book also that had no quotation marks, and I don't mind it, but I don't get why this is a trend or why this is a stylistic choice that people are making in books like this. But I digress. So we're following an unnamed narrator. None of the characters are named. Sometimes she's called the mother, and then she has the child. But she left her art career to raise her son after she tried to work after having him and found it too distressing to be away from him, in part also because her husband works at a job where he's gone during the week and he's only home on the weekends. And we come into this story when her son is about 1.5, so she's been a stay-at-home mom for a while, and she believes that she's turning into a dog. And she kind of jokes with her husband, but she very much truly believes that she's turning into a dog and starts to call herself Night Bitch when she's in this mode. And this is not a mental illness conversation. It is implied pretty heavily in the book that this is actually happening, although it's never outright stated in either direction that it's happening. And then there's also a subplot or a follow-up plot where she goes to a baby and me reading thing with other moms who may also be turning into dogs, but Mostly all we see is them being involved in an MLM scheme. And then it ends really anticlimactically. So maybe I just didn't get it. I thought that this had a lot of potential to be a really interesting, like, horror or satire, or even like maybe an interesting look at the frustration of being a stay-at-home mom while also like juggling the sadness and grief of leaving a career, and maybe even the sadness and grief of feeling like, oh, maybe I'm not a good feminist because I chose to stay home even though that was actually the best decision for me and my family. That's not a new story. That's a really common conversation right now, but that doesn't mean it can't be done in an interesting way. And I thought, oh, this person is literally turning into a dog. And we talk, like, the word bitch is used as derogatory all the time, especially for women who are maybe, you know, not feeling fulfilled for whatever reason, or who are expected to do it all. But it was just boring. It felt whiny and it felt unimaginative, which is really hard to do when you're talking about someone turning into a dog. The MLM scheme felt like kind of tacked on, and I don't know, it just wasn't for me. Maybe I don't understand satire, maybe I'm not smart enough for it. I don't think that's the case. I think that this was just boring and poorly done and it's like an overhashed topic, and it wasn't done in a way that gripped me or made me care. So I gave this 2 stars. It was relatively interesting. The language was kind of cool, but overall the execution just, ugh. That was a really lovely worded way to explain it, but I did not enjoy this book. I would also like to point out that in Night Bitch, I was not too surprised that there was some like violence, animal violence, because a character who's turning into like a wolf or a dog, there were scenes with hunting or being driven by instinct about hunting, and that I was prepared for. But there is a scene in this book of like really grisly animal cruelty that seemed extremely unnecessary. And again, I can understand why animal cruelty or gore or like disturbing things should be included in books. Like, I'm going to talk about that a lot in the next book that I read. But this felt like it was inserted into this book just to be edgy. And it was shocking. It was upsetting. But I don't feel that it really served the story, because there had already been something that kind of suggested, that this is real, that this person is actually turning into a dog. And the second animal cruelty scene was entirely unnecessary. So that definitely kind of almost bumped it down to a 1. And I just do not recommend this if you're really squeamish about that. To follow that up, I read The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is the first Stephen Graham Jones that I've read, and I will definitely be reading more. Spoiler, I guess, on how much I enjoyed this book. I did end up giving this 4 stars. To kind of contrast in Night Bitch, there is also animal cruelty in this book, and there are gory scenes in this book. But it served the story. This is also horror. There is no question that this is a horror novel from the first chapter. So it makes more sense that the gore comes when it does. Some of it's not telegraphed super soon, but I think that the shock and the visceral feeling that you get from it really serves this book, because it puts you in the same shock that the characters are experiencing. But just a heads up on that as well, that there is some pretty intense gore involving both humans and animals in this book. It actively scared me, so it succeeded there. And you're following 4 men who are of the Blackfeet tribe about a decade after they kind of broke both federal laws and tribal laws, and the consequences of that once they hit a certain anniversary. There's a little bit of a plot hole, because one of the characters, like early on, faces the consequences of this long before any of the other characters do, and I don't really know how that tied in or why that happened to that character sooner. But I would say that was my biggest criticism of the book, is there's like a couple weird plot holes, or just like not even plot holes, but like weaknesses and things not explained as to why things happened in the order that they did, or why things had like the stretching out that they did. But overall, this book was really good. Like I said, it actively scared me. Do not read this at night. I did because I don't know how to take good care of myself. So don't do what I do, kids. It's a bad idea. And again, this was kind of a modern fairy tale, or rather modern folklore, but in a different way than Split Tooth. This is much more straightforward as to what's happening as opposed to lyrical. It's just horror as opposed to trying to make it like a modern fable, although there is an Aesop to it, I suppose. And I really found the ending satisfying. There are a couple of things, like I said, the plot twist as well as the unfortunate collateral damage that happens in this book, but I think that the collateral damage does make this much scarier. It just sucks. And you start to really like these characters, and it very quickly stabs you in the stomach if you like any of them. So just a heads up that there is not a lot of happy going on in this book. I found the playing with the cliche of like the Indian curse really interesting. It's not something that I see super often. I know that Stephen Graham Jones himself is Native. I don't know what tribe he's from. I'm going to assume Blackfeet, but I probably shouldn't make assumptions. But I did like how that wasn't shied away from in this book. But it was used in a new way. It's not like the Poltergeist movie. It's not like what you see in old westerns. It's just a different take on a curse. Are people actually cursed? Do we bring curses upon ourselves? What does that look like? Are we cursing future generations? As well as just the conversations about identity and what it means to be Indian and what it means to be Native or Indigenous. There's also a brief conversation about that I thought was done really well. But yeah, I enjoyed this horror novel, and I'm looking forward to reading other books by Stephen Graham Jones. I actually have My Heart is a Chainsaw on hold at my library right now. Then finally in August, I read Yoke by H.K. Choi. This is a YA contemporary, although I would argue if new adult is still a thing, that this falls more under new adult than YA. Regardless, we are following two sisters who live in New York City. The younger one is Jane, and she is a marketing student at a university in New York, and she is struggling with an eating disorder. She's kind of a hot mess because she also is like illegally subletting and isn't really dating someone but acts like they're dating. She doesn't really know what she's doing. And then her older sister, June, who has a finance job and seems to have it all together, but Jane always thinks that she's kind of weird and that she's soulless, like she doesn't really let herself live. And they don't really like each other that much, but they still kind of look out for each other because they're siblings. They're also the children of Korean immigrants, and there is a lot of conversation about that in the book. And how that probably impacted their relationship. There's a lot to be said about the children of immigrants in the United States and the two different worlds that they inhabit that I think was done really beautifully in this book. But ultimately, what happens is June finds out that she may have cancer and contacts Jane, and then we're following most of the book through all of the book, through Jane's point of view as she tries to navigate her relationship with June, her relationship with her parents, and her relationship with herself, and how that all works out together. I thought this was beautifully done. I have already read Emergency Contact by H.K. Choi, so that's why, even though I'm not usually a YA fan, I decided to give this a go. And it's a story about sisters. I am a younger sister. I have been the younger sister that identifies as the Hot Mess Express more than once. Definitely related to the dynamic of these sisters on occasion. I do think that my relationship with my sister is a little more positive, at least the beginning of their relationship. My relationship is a bit stronger, but I do still totally empathize with Jane as a younger sister, not really being seen as an adult, and just trying to figure out who she is in her early 20s while also trying to navigate some really serious stuff in her family when they've never really let her do that. So I thought this was really well done. It's a tearjerker. I got it done really quickly though. Maybe that's because it's YA and that makes the writings a bit simpler. I didn't feel talked down to in this book. The romance aspects of it, not the romance aspects, but like the romantic relationship aspects that are in this book, I think are done really well and realistically. There's a little bit of idealism in it, but that's okay. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed this. I think if you have sisters or siblings that you sometimes have a contentious relationship with, you can definitely get a lot of value out of this book. I'll see if I can find a picture of it, but this also has like a really beautiful cover where the sisters are actually holding hands across the edges of the pages, which I thought was neat, and kind of binds in with a lot of the themes of the book. Overall, I gave this 4 stars. I love books about sisters, and I think I'm gonna keep looking into H.K. Choi's works, even though they are under YA and they tend to be like issues books. They're done in a way that doesn't feel condescending and feels very authentic. And those are the books that I read in August. It is way too late. I'm going to try to edit this and get it up soon, and I will see you next time. Bye!